I'm a high school history teacher, and today I'll be discussing the original Call of Duty from 2003 and its expansion, United Offensive, released in 2004. I've been excited to get back to these older games because there was so much more focus on history compared to the modern entries in the COD series. Like my other videos, today we'll explore the historical context behind the events of the game. Without further ado, let's get right into it. The first Call of Duty featured 3 campaigns: the Americans, British, and Soviets. Before we get into the campaigns, let's discuss the causes of World War II to set the stage. Since this game only takes place in Europe, we'll save the Pacific Theater for another video. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, representatives of the German government and the Western Allies met in a railway car to sign an armistice. After a brutal 4 years with millions dead, World War I finally came to an end. The war saw the collapse of the Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian empires, and in 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed, redrawing the map of Europe. The treaty also established extremely harsh terms against Germany. Germany was required to limit the size of its military, remove all forces from the Rhineland, dismantle its air force and navy, accept responsibility for World War I, and pay reparations to the Allies. The German government had financed the war by printing money, which led to significant debt and inflation by the 1920s, and it only got worse. The demand for reparations from the Treaty of Versailles put even more pressure on the German government, and in 1923, the German economy experienced hyperinflation. People's savings were completely devalued and the economy went into a tailspin. Adolf Hitler had served in the German army during World War I, and in the 1920s he gained notoriety for his speaking ability. He led meetings of the German Workers' Party, which later evolved into the Nazi Party. After a failed coup attempt in 1923, Hitler was arrested, and while in jail he wrote Mein Kampf, a book in which he explained his beliefs and plans for Germany. Hitler viewed Germany's surrender at the end of World War I as a betrayal. He blamed communists and social democrats who he believed were secretly working for Jewish interests. The spread of the Great Depression to Germany only worsened the economic and political tension, and in 1932 the Nazi Party won more seats in the Reichstag than any other party. In January 1933, the aging president Paul von Hindenburg named Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. Later that year, Hitler was given emergency powers to act unilaterally, becoming the dictator of Germany. Almost immediately, Hitler began undoing the Treaty of Versailles. He reintroduced conscription, established the Luftwaffe as Germany's air force, sent German troops to reoccupy the Rhineland in the west, and all the while Britain and France did nothing. Hitler wanted to unify all the German-speaking parts of Europe into one big state, so in 1938 he annexed Austria. Again, the British and the French did nothing. Hitler made the case that since some parts of Czechoslovakia, known as the Sudetenland, were German-speaking, they should be included in his nation too. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, French Prime Minister Edouard Daladier, Hitler, and Mussolini all met in Munich in 1938. At the end of this meeting, it was agreed that Czechoslovakia should be forced to give up the Sudetenland to Germany, as long as Hitler promised to stop expanding aggressively. After taking the Sudetenland, Hitler then invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia over the next few months. Having conquered most of Central Europe, Hitler now turned to Poland. The Treaty of Versailles established Poland as a new nation following the collapse of the Russian Empire. The Poles were given this land, called the Danzig Corridor, which split East Prussia from the rest of Germany. Hitler wanted to undo this division. Britain and France finally woke up and gave Hitler an ultimatum: if you invade Poland, it will be war. The invasion of Poland is the event that sparked World War II, but there were 3 deeper causes that gave Hitler the confidence to launch the invasion in the first place. Firstly, British and French appeasement. Hitler didn't believe that the British and French threats of war were serious. I mean, how could he? For years they sat idly by while he acted with impunity. This strategy of appeasement is understandable, especially from the French. The horrific Western Front of World War I left a scar in France that is still healing today. They wanted to never again experience the horrors of modern war, but in doing nothing in the face of Hitler's aggression, they gave Hitler the impression that they weren't serious about the ultimatum over Poland. Another major cause of World War II was American isolation. Like the British and French, the Americans were also scarred from World War I. They lost over 100,000 soldiers in a conflict that many argued the US shouldn't have joined in the first place. Throughout the interwar period, the US mostly stayed out of European affairs, especially during the Great Depression. The US didn't sign the Treaty of Versailles, nor did it join the new League of Nations. Had the US been more involved and placed pressure on Germany to not act aggressively, maybe Hitler's ambitions would have been tempered. The last major cause of World War II in Europe was Soviet collaboration with the Nazis. In 1917, amidst the chaos of World War I, the Russian Revolution resulted in the collapse of the Russian Empire and the establishment of the Soviet Union by the early 1920s. It was no secret that Hitler hated communists, so why would they ever work together? The Soviet Union was left out of negotiations in the Treaty of Versailles, and Poland was formerly a part of the Russian Empire. The leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, wanted that territory back. On August 23, 1939, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany made a non-aggression pact, promising to not invade each other and to split Poland between themselves. The pact also included trade between them, including shipments of raw materials needed for war production from the Soviets to the Nazis. This agreement gave Hitler the final confidence boost he needed to invade Poland. So on September 1, 1939, German forces rushed into Poland with a combined arms assault featuring fast troop movements supported by tanks, artillery, and aircraft. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Now that we understand the causes of World War II, let's get into each of the campaigns. I'll be going mostly chronologically, so we'll start with the British campaigns in the United Offensive expansion, then the American campaigns, then the original British campaign, and finally the Soviet campaigns. The opening briefing introduces us to the B-17 bomber, nicknamed the Flying Fortress. We'll be playing as a member of a crew of a B-17, but first some quick context. After Britain and France declared war, not much changed in the first few months. But in April 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway to secure oil fields and prepare air bases for attacks against Britain. In May, Germany rapidly invaded the Netherlands, followed by France in June. Now, unlike in World War I, the Germans successfully defeated France, establishing a firm grip over Western Europe. In July 1940, Germany launched an aerial assault across the English Channel that later became known as the Battle of Britain. For months, the Luftwaffe and the Royal Air Force battled in the skies. The British succeeded in fending off the German attackers, thanks in part to the development of new radar technology. Still, German bombers terrorized Britain during the Blitz until around May 1941. Prior to the United States' entry into the war, and despite their official neutrality, the US did supply the under-equipped RAF with some B-17 bombers. In the mission intro, our character Doyle remarks on the absurdity of daytime bombing raids. To offset the risks of bombing missions in the daytime, pilots would often fly at high altitudes, but this meant that it was harder to hit targets precisely. Once the US entered the war, bombing raids over Germany increased dramatically, and this difficulty with precision led to the deaths of thousands of civilians. Back to the game, we're on a mission to destroy a factory near Rotterdam in the Netherlands. We man the dorsal gun of the B-17 and hold off waves of German fighters. Throughout the fight, our plane gets more and more damaged and some crew members are killed, so we take their posts at the rear and side guns. When the time comes, we manually open the bomb bay doors and release the bombs. At the end of our mission, our plane is shot down and Doyle is now stuck in enemy territory. We awaken tangled up in a tree, surrounded by German soldiers. Fortunately, we're rescued by Major Ingram, a British officer who's been working with the Dutch resistance. Ingram is a fictional member of the real-life Special Operations Executive. After the fall of Western Europe, Winston Churchill set up the SOE to lead covert operations and organize resistance against the Nazis. After scavenging some German weapons, we make our way down to this village, clear out the German presence, and move into the forest. Eventually, we find our target, a rail bridge. I place some explosive charges on the bridge, then make my way back up to Ingram to watch the fireworks. The next mission jumps forward 2 years to 1943 during Operation Husky, which was the Allied invasion of Sicily and Italy. Doyle is now a full-blown member of the SOE and will be leading an attack on some coastal artillery batteries to take pressure off of the amphibious landings. We'll be joined by the Special Air Service, or SAS. This elite force was formed in 1941 and in real life did carry out raids along the coast of Sicily before Operation Husky. We take a local fishing boat to a small dock where I use my silenced Sten submachine gun to take out the guards. It isn't long before our cover's blown and we have to fight our way up the ridge to this lighthouse, which I rig with explosives. We move up and assault the fort at the top of the hill, destroying radios and taking out the surrounding guards before moving inside. Once inside, I blow up the coastal batteries and rig some dynamite in the ammo storage area. We fight our way out of the bunker and I hop in the sidecar of a motorcycle with Major Ingram. Sadly, our SAS boys take a direct hit from a panzer tank, so Ingram and I race down to the shore alone where we board a boat out of there, watching the explosives as we ride into the sunset. In real life, the invasion of Sicily was a success. It triggered the collapse of Mussolini's fascist regime, and German forces had to be rerouted south to Italy. Before we continue with the British missions from the original campaign, let's dive into the American campaigns. As I mentioned earlier, the United States was neutral throughout the first 2 years of World War II. Despite official neutrality, after the German invasion of Poland in 1939, the US began selling weapons again to the British and the French. The draft was reinstated in 1940, and that same year, the US traded several destroyer-class warships to Britain in exchange for military bases in Canada and the Caribbean. In January 1941, President Roosevelt gave a famous speech in which he explained that the US was supporting Britain in the war to protect the free world from tyranny. In March 1941, the Lend-Lease Act was signed, providing food, weapons, ammunition, battleships, oil, and other materials mainly to Britain, but also to China, who was fighting Japan at the time. The Soviet Union was later included in the Lend-Lease after the Germans betrayed them. By mid-1941, the US was already significantly involved in the war, but then in August, the US placed an embargo on oil shipments to Japan. On December 7, 1941, the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii was bombed by the Japanese. The following day, the US declared war on Japan. A few days later, Germany declared war on the US, and the Americans responded in kind. With the US now fully involved in World War II, Americans were volunteering for the military in droves. Industry shifted to military production, rationing was introduced, and men were being trained for combat. One new experimental force was created, the Airborne. These soldiers would be trained to jump out of airplanes behind enemy lines and conduct sabotage or other special operations. The HBO miniseries Band of Brothers follows the 101st Airborne Division in their journey across Europe, and in the American campaign, we'll be playing through several key moments of these operations. In the loading screen of our first mission as Private Martin, he describes the intense training he endured. The training mission takes place at Camp Toccoa, Georgia, the real-life training ground shown in Episode 1 of Band of Brothers. Part of their training was to run up and down Currahee Mountain, 3 miles up and 3 miles down. It's so cool that the game's tutorial takes place in this iconic training ground. I also really like the use of propaganda posters to give tips on gameplay. Martin describes long marches that he's forced to do. In real life, they started with night marches that were already 11 miles long, but they slowly increased in length. In late 1942, the battalion marched 118 miles to Atlanta in 3 days. The training was tough, but it was nothing compared to what the American paratroopers would experience in Europe. In the next mission, we're briefed on our roles in the upcoming Operation Overlord, better known as D-Day. The game does a great job explaining the roles of the airborne in this operation, so I'll just roll the footage.
On H-Hour D-Day, Seaborne Infantry will attack 5 beaches codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword here on the coast of Normandy. The Airborne will be landing 6 hours before H-Hour, before the air and naval bombardments. The British 6th Airborne Division will be landing here. At the same time, the 101st and the 82nd Airborne will be landing in these areas. The Dews River estuary here divides Utah and Omaha Beach. The mission of the 101st is to capture the Dews River crossings linking Utah and Omaha Beach and to protect the flanks of Utah Beach. This road here is the main highway that connects the entire Cotentin Peninsula. The Germans have troop concentrations in this region. When those troops are mobilized into a counterattack on the beaches, they'll have to move along this road. The 101st is going to make sure that doesn't happen.
On the last day before the invasion, Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower visited the troops and gave a famous speech.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.
On the evening of June 5th, 1944, the 101st Airborne took off in their C-47s across the English Channel. The beach landings in Normandy would take place the following morning, but there was a lot of work to do before then. The men in the aircraft made peace with themselves and mentally prepared for the hell they were about to jump into. As the planes flew over France, the German anti-air guns lit up the sky. Many men lost their lives in planes before they could even jump out. The nighttime jump was chaotic, people missed their landing zones, and American paratroopers were spread out across the peninsula with only hours to go until their objectives had to be captured. In this mission, I land near St. Mary-Glise, totally on my own. Up ahead, I find a dead paratrooper tangled up in a tree, and I loot his leg bag. In real life, just before the jump into Normandy, many paratroopers' bags were replaced with these leg bags. Unfortunately, the leg bags were poorly designed, and lots of guys lost their bags as they jumped out of the planes. This was described in Band of Brothers, and it's a neat little reference that you get to loot one of the leg bags here. I place a radio beacon to signal for more troops to drop in, and I defend the position as they land in the field. Moving into St. Mary-Glise, we can see the apocalyptic hellscape ahead of us. Time to get to work. We move from building to building, clearing out the Germans and taking the city. We destroy several anti-air vehicles, and the city is ours. A few hours later, the beach landings are underway, and now that we've captured the city, we have to defend it against a counterattack. Fortunately, the Germans left some anti-tank weapons laying around, so we use them to our advantage to destroy the advancing panzers. After holding off waves of tanks, infantry, and mortar teams, the mission's over. Our radios are destroyed and we won't be able to hold out much longer, so we take a ride in a car to hand-deliver a message to battalion headquarters, fighting off German paratroopers along the way. Arriving at HQ, it's a mess. People are still missing from every unit, and the beach landings are underway. We've been chosen to locate and destroy an artillery battery that's firing on Utah Beach. The guns are located at Brecourt Manor, a large estate with hedgerows and trenches surrounding it. This is a real mission shown in episode 2 of Band of Brothers. Approaching the first artillery gun, one squad distracts the German machine gunners while we flank them from the side. Once we capture the gun, we blow it up with some dynamite, then we move on to the next through the trenches. In this bunker, I grab a set of German documents, then we move outside to take out the remaining guns. By the end, our little squad was able to destroy several German artillery batteries and secure Bricourt Manor all on our own. Normally I'd think about how unrealistic this is, but it's actually based on a true story. In real life, a small team led by Lieutenant Richard Winters was able to capture and destroy the guns at Bricourt Manor, despite being heavily outnumbered. Winters and several of his men were awarded medals for this operation, and it's still taught at West Point as an example of a well-executed assault by a small force on a well-defended fixed position. The success of the airborne enabled the beachheads to link up, establishing a secure front to push through Normandy. The success of Operation Overlord and the liberation of France depended on the success of these operations behind enemy lines, and the historical significance made playing these missions even more fun. A couple months later, our unit has been chosen for some special operations near the Bavarian Alps in Germany. Major Ingram of the British SOE has been captured, along with a Captain Price, who is apparently the grandfather of the Captain Price from the Modern Warfare games. It's our job to rescue Price and Ingram, so we move through this town trying to locate them. Moving through this fancy chateau, in the basement we find Captain Price, who tells us that Major Ingram has been moved to a nearby POW camp. In the next mission, we have to raid the camp and get Ingram out within 10 minutes before reinforcements show up. I rush from building to building until I eventually find Ingram, and we escape on a truck with several minutes to spare. The United Offensive missions continue the 101st Airborne story into the winter of 1944-45. Having liberated most of France, by late 1944 the Allies were ready to push into Germany, but Hitler ordered a last-ditch, desperate effort to push the Allies back by sending 30 German divisions into the Ardennes forest. German tanks and infantry marched through Belgium and into France, pushing the Americans back and creating a bulge in the front lines, hence the name the Battle of the Bulge. The 101st Airborne was called in to assist in defending the line, and in the process they were surrounded near the town of Bastogne in Belgium. The Americans were poorly prepared for the harsh winter. They had little ammunition, no winter clothing, and limited food. Furthermore, the foggy weather made it extremely difficult to drop any supplies to the encircled Americans. Rather than give up in this desperate situation, the men of the 101st Airborne never surrendered. A German commander demanded their surrender, but Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe simply replied, "Nuts!" So the 101st dug in and waited. The loading screen of the first mission summarizes the situation. We're waiting to repel an anticipated attack. We go on a patrol to locate the enemy, and we find them across a field, dug in, shooting their MG-42s at us. We hop in a jeep and drive back to our foxholes, dodging Germans along the way. When we finally get back to our foxholes, German artillery is landing all around us, exploding the trees nearby. This scene reminds me of episode 7 of Band of Brothers, where the hell of artillery barrages is on full display. I see a wounded soldier being dragged through the snow, and another one in a foxhole takes a direct hit from artillery. I move from foxhole to foxhole, holding off the waves of German attackers. After a while, we finally get some assistance from bombers and tanks, and the level ends. In real life, the 101st held out for days until General Patton's Third Army broke through to Bastogne on December 26th, but the fight didn't stop there. The division was called on to push the Germans back. Our next mission involves securing the crossroads south of the town of Foy in preparation for the eventual assault on Foy itself. We move through the dark night, freezing our butts off and taking down German patrols in the area. After repelling another German counterattack, the crossroads are secure and it's time for the assault on Foy. In real life, the trees in the area around Bastogne were planted in rows, giving the Germans perfect sightlines into the paratroopers' positions, and they endured heavy shelling in the days before the assault. The attack on Foy was depicted in episode 7 of Band of Brothers, and this mission clearly took some design notes. We charge across the field, dodging artillery rounds and machine gun fire, taking cover behind hay bales and sheds, finally making it to the nearest houses. We disable the artillery and move through the town, eliminating the German presence. I died so many times crossing this bridge, so now would be a good time to mention that I love the quotes that the game puts on the screen every time you die. It does a good job of immersing the player, reminding us that we're participating in real historical events. After a lot of hard work, Foy is finally ours. You'd think that the 101st would be pulled off the front lines after all this, but nope. Our next orders are to assault the town of Neuville. Major Winters' real-life reaction sums it up perfectly. When word came down for this attack, it pissed me off. I could not believe that after what we had gone through and done, after all the casualties we'd suffered, they were putting us into an attack. Man, this mission was difficult. It was pretty straightforward at first as we moved through the houses and yards, very similar to Foy, but the last section of the level was so brutal. After capturing the chateau, we have to hold off wave after wave of German counterattacks, including tanks. It was the first part of the game where I had to use quick saves to get through it. This game uses a traditional health bar instead of regenerating health. You have to use med packs to heal. Once you're out of med packs, that's it. The game won't save on its own if you're low on health, and I got stuck here for a while. Eventually I drove the Germans back and we held Neuville. Captain Foley tells us to break out the champagne and relax, but in real life, the 101st continued on to yet another attack at Rechamps. Only then were they finally given some time to rest. The final debrief shows a map of our progress from Bastogne to Neuville, and the synopsis summarizes the rest of the 101st journey in Europe. After crossing the Rhine River into Germany, the 101st liberated the Kaufering 4 concentration camp in April 1945. In early May, as the German forces were finally surrendering, the 101st captured Hitler's Eagle's Nest, a bunker high in the Alps that Hitler used as a private retreat. If you'd like some more context on these events, I highly recommend you check out Band of Brothers. It's a must-watch for anyone interested in World War II. If you've seen the show, I highly recommend the original book by Stephen Ambrose for some stories that were left out of the TV series. Back to the game, now let's move on to the original British campaign. During Operation Overlord, the British and Canadians played a crucial role in the landings, capturing 3 of the 5 beachheads in Normandy. Since the British landings at Sword Beach were exposed to German reinforcements from the east, British airborne divisions were deployed in the area to secure the eastern flank, much like what the American 101st did with the southern flank. This was called Operation Tonga. In the first mission, our objective is to secure a bridge at the Caen Canal, another operation that really happened during World War II. We drop in on a Horsa glider landing in a field. In this campaign, we play as Sergeant Evans under the command of Captain Price. We move to capture the bridge, then the next morning we have to hold off German counterattacks until reinforcements arrive. Thankfully, there's a flak gun to use against the Panzers, but this section was tough. Operation Tonga was a success. Now Price and Evans have been promoted to the SAS. In 1943, the Royal Air Force conducted Operation Chastise, in which they destroyed a couple of German dams that were powering local factories. The RAF used special bouncing bombs designed to go over the protective netting and hit the dams. Although the Möhne and Ettersee dams were broken, causing massive flooding and over 1,000 civilian deaths, the dams were repaired within a year. In this level, we'll be sneaking into the Ettersee Dam to sabotage its anti-air defenses so that the bombers can make another run. This mission didn't happen in real life, but it gives us an opportunity for some fun gameplay, so I'm not complaining. I move across the dam, blowing up the anti-air guns as I go. I sabotage the generators using dynamite and rendezvous with Captain Price on top of the dam. We escape in a truck, driving past tons of German reinforcements on our way to an airfield. It's an epic escape sequence, and when we get to the airfield, I hop on this anti-air gun and defend our position from ground troops and Stuka dive bombers. Eventually, our getaway plane arrives and we make our escape. Our next objective as the SAS is to sabotage the German battleship Tirpitz, one of the largest and most powerful ships in the German Navy. In real life, the British were targeting the Tirpitz for years because it was interfering with Allied convoys in the Arctic Ocean. The Tirpitz is stationed on Hokoya Island in Norway being repaired, and it's our job to sabotage it before an RAF bombing mission. We approach the Tirpitz in a small boat with stolen uniforms while Price signals to the ship in Morse code. We infiltrate the armory, grabbing weapons and explosives, then I place charges around the ship's boilers. Sadly, Captain Price is killed on our way back to the surface. It happens so quickly and it's easy to miss it. I climb up to the bridge and steal some documents, then return to Sergeant Waters at the boat to escape. While this mission was fictional, the Tirpitz really was stationed at Hokoya Island before it was finally destroyed by the RAF in a bombing operation in November 1944. The final British mission in this game takes place in February 1945. We're on another fictional mission, this time to destroy a V-2 rocket launch site. After the failure of the Luftwaffe to defeat the RAF in the Battle of Britain, the Germans began experimenting with other methods of bombing London. The V-1 flying bomb, also known as the Buzz bomb, had an operational maximum range of around 250 kilometers, but could be countered by anti-aircraft weaponry. So the Germans developed the V-2 rocket, the first modern ballistic missile. The V-2 would fly nearly into space before zooming back down at supersonic speeds. There was no audible warning before striking its target, and there was no effective countermeasure to the V-2. In late 1944 and early 45, thousands of V-2 rockets were launched at Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and even within Germany. All the Allies could do was try to locate and destroy the launch sites. In this mission, we're in northwest Germany looking for one. We move through the snow, executing German patrols and clearing bunkers until we eventually reach the rockets. The V-2s are about to launch, and we don't have enough firepower to destroy them, so we get creative. We infiltrate this bunker and fill the rockets with fuel, then place dynamite and watch the fireworks. Mission accomplished. With the British and American campaigns finished, it's time for the Soviet campaign. First, some context on Germany's betrayal of the Soviets. Prior to the Non-Aggression Pact, Stalin was suspicious that Finland could be invaded and used as a staging ground for an invasion of the USSR. He demanded that the Finns cede territory to him as a buffer, and when this didn't happen, the Soviets manufactured a false flag incident to start a war with Finland. This conflict, known as the Winter War, did eventually result in some territorial concessions from Finland, but it embarrassed the Soviets by showing the ineffectiveness of the Red Army. Hitler began thinking that a successful invasion of the USSR could be possible. Despite the Non-Aggression Pact and the joint invasion of Poland, Stalin was always wary of Hitler's intentions. Stalin had read Mein Kampf and understood Hitler's desire for land in Eastern Europe. So why was Stalin caught off guard when the Nazis invaded? As German forces built up in the east, Stalin's spies in Germany were feeding him disinformation. One false story was that the Germans were simply using the east as a training ground for an invasion of Britain. Another was that these forces were to be used for an attack on British interests in Greece and the Middle East. The most plausible story, though, was that the Germans were using the buildup of forces to try to get territorial concessions from Stalin without war. Stalin couldn't believe that Hitler would be so foolish as to open a second front while still at war with Britain, but he was wrong. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in world history against the Soviet Union, catching Stalin by surprise. Throughout late 1941, the Germans drove deep into Soviet territory, encircling massive numbers of Red Army troops. Death squads rounded up Jews, communists, and Soviet POWs, executing them all by the thousands. By late September, the Germans were within 15 miles of Moscow. The Battle of Moscow raged until January 1942, when Soviet reinforcements arrived and pushed the Germans back over 100 miles from the city. The Battle of Moscow cost the Soviets more lives than the Americans or British lost in the entire war. With the effort to capture Moscow stalled out, Hitler turned his attention south, where he directed his forces to capture Stalingrad in order to secure the Caucasus region. The Battle of Stalingrad is sometimes considered the turning point of the war on the Eastern Front, and this is where the Soviet campaign begins. The loading screen shows real text from Stalin's Order 227, famous for the line, "Not a single step back." Any soldier who retreated without orders would be considered a traitor. Throughout World War II, the Soviets detained over 100,000 soldiers for deserting, many of whom were later executed, though the exact numbers are unclear. Using the real text from Order 227 for the loading screen is some great attention to detail, and the propaganda posters in the back are a nice touch too. In real life, the Germans captured most of Stalingrad, but then were encircled and slowly eliminated from the city. The first level begins in a boat as we cross the Volga River while the Commissar reminds us of Order 227. In real life, it was the Commissar's duty to enforce order and discipline in the ranks, report any anti-government attitudes, and enforce orders like Order 227. Crossing the Volga, we're attacked by Stukas and one guy jumps overboard, but the Commissars shoot the deserter. Once across the river, I'm given some ammunition and the guy in front of me gets the rifle. When the other guy falls, I pick up his weapon and carry on. The notion that the Red Army regularly sent soldiers into combat without weapons is mostly false. It was popularized by the movie Enemy at the Gates, but while the Red Army did experience supply shortages, especially in 1941, by Stalingrad in 1942 those issues were mostly resolved. And while the Red Army certainly placed little value in the lives of individual soldiers, instances where they lacked rifles were extremely rare. Back to the game, the scene is loud and chaotic. Bullets are raining everywhere and the shadowy ruins fill the horizon. Our only saving grace is an artillery barrage that takes out the machine guns above us. At the beginning of the next mission, we see more retreating soldiers executed by the Commissars. Charging through the square, the enemy position is well fortified, so I flank them using buildings on the side. The next level has us fighting through ruins of the devastated city, really showcasing the scale of the destruction. The following mission takes place in the Stalingrad sewers. There really were battles in the sewers of Stalingrad in real life. The entire city was a war zone. These levels at Stalingrad do a great job of showing the sheer brutality of the war on the Eastern Front. 80% of all German soldiers who died in World War II were killed by the Soviets, and the Soviets lost more people than any other warring country. The Red Army's nihilistic tactics of attrition played a big role in these high casualty rates, but both sides committed countless war crimes against each other. Prisoners of war often never made it home. Back in the game, moving through the sewers, we hear German announcements promising us food and medical treatment if we surrender. Yeah, right. Finally outside, I use my comrade as bait to draw out sniper fire so I can take them out. We charge across the field and capture an apartment building, then hold off against waves of German counterattacks. By the time the Battle of Stalingrad was over in early 1943, somewhere between 1 and 3 million people on both sides were dead. The battle was so destructive that we don't even know the true numbers, we can only guess. Despite the heavy losses, Stalingrad was a victory for the Soviets, and it was the furthest east that the German army ever reached. By July 1943, the Red Army had created a bulge in the German front lines around the city of Kursk. At this point, the Germans didn't have the supplies or the manpower for full frontal assaults, so they decided to strike into the Kursk salient from the north and the south. This action, codenamed Operation Citadel, would put the German army in a much better position if they could just pinch off and surround the Red Army. The Soviet campaign in the United Offensive expansion begins here at the Battle of Kursk. We sit in the trenches, enduring a massive artillery barrage before the Germans come charging. We repel the attackers as chaos unfolds around us. When the attack finally stops, the Germans try to flank us through a nearby village, so I regroup with my unit to stop them. After what felt like forever, we're relieved by a group of T-34 tanks and the level ends. The next level has us assaulting the small town of Ponary, heavily fortified by the Germans. Using the tanks as shields, I advance through this rail station, taking out snipers and rocket infantry. In real life, the town of Ponary was brutally contested, earning it the nickname the Stalingrad of Kursk, which is referenced in the loading screen for the mission. The next level lets us drive a T-34 tank to stop a German offensive at Prokhorovka, another real-life part of the Battle of Kursk. The gameplay is pretty simple. I blast the enemy tanks while keeping my heavily armored front facing towards them. The Battle of Kursk was the largest tank battle in history, and one of the largest battles in all of world history. This level really gives you a sense of that scale. With the smoldering ruins of German tanks littering the fields, the level ends in victory. The next few levels take place in Kharkov in late August 1943. For weeks, the Red Army had been working to take back the city, and now the time has come to finish the job. In this mission, we use binoculars to call in artillery strikes on German guns, clearing the way for the T-34s to break through. These levels are pretty similar to those in Stalingrad. We fight from building to building, crawling through the ruins and debris, carving a path of death and destruction. After a while, these missions sort of blend together and we become numb to the horror. Red Army veteran and writer Vasily Grossman described it. Sometimes it feels that I've spent so much time traveling around in trucks, sleeping in sheds and half-burned houses, it's as if I've never really lived any other sort of life. I've seen so much it would be enough for anyone. We finally reach the main square of the city, clearing the Germans out and then using an anti-aircraft gun to hold off the Luftwaffe. Finally, we capture a train yard and have to hold it until reinforcements arrive. I alternate between using the artillery to destroy tanks and ducking down to avoid the Stuka dive bombers. Eventually, reinforcements arrive and we've seized Kharkov. The Battle of Kursk was the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front. From August 1943 to May 1945, the Germans were forced to retreat all the way back to Berlin. Historians debate whether the Battle of Stalingrad or the Battle of Kursk were more significant. What do you think? Throughout 1944, as the Americans and British pushed through France and Belgium into Germany, the Soviets continued their struggle in the Eastern Front. The next Soviet mission is back in the original game, set in Warsaw in January 1945. Fighting through the factories, we show no mercy to the defending Germans. As in Stalingrad and Kharkov, we move from building to building, exacting revenge. As we approach the Oder River, we get to drive a tank again. Just like in the Battle of Kursk, the real-life battle in Warsaw featured thousands of tanks, but on a much smaller scale in comparison. Despite the fact that Germany was being pushed back in both the East and the West, they refused to surrender. Hitler was determined to make the Allies pay a heavy price for victory. The final mission of this game is to capture the Reichstag, the German parliament building in Berlin. It's April 1945 and the loading screen shows a message from our commanding officer. We've come a long way, and now it's time for the final push to defeat the Nazis, but it won't be easy. I charge up the hill, destroying the artillery so the tanks can move up. When we reach the square in front of the Reichstag, German machine guns pin us down until the tanks arrive. As they bombard the building, we charge across the field and up the steps while triumphant music plays. I fight through the decaying building to the roof where I meet the flag bearer. He waves the flag of the Soviet Union and the mission ends. The final cutscene shows real footage from the end of World War II. The narrator describes shaking hands with an American, and although he can't understand what the American was saying, he felt that he was his brother. Sadly, these feelings didn't last. Back in February 1945, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin met in Yalta to discuss plans for after the war. The German army officially surrendered on May 7, 1945, and post-war plans for Germany were solidified at another conference in Potsdam in July. Germany would be split up between a capitalist West and a communist East. The ideological difference between the US and the Soviet Union led to the Cold War, but if you want to learn more about that, go check out my videos in the Black Ops games. World War II was the worst, most destructive conflict in human history, and there's no way I could do it justice in one video. I recently played Battlefield 5 for the first time, so if you'd like to see a video on that game or the other Call of Duty games, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace out for now.